He brought us the world every weeknight at 10 p.m.
I never felt smaller in my life than when I was doing the biggest story of my life.
It's a distinct honor to bring you this conversation with the CBC's great foreign correspondent, Brian Stewart. I'm Paul Wells. Welcome to The Paul Wells Show. You can make an argument that road stories about foreign correspondent work in the 1980s, when the Berlin Wall was still up and the CBC still had money and an audience, are not particularly relevant to today's world. Or you can read Brian Stewart's new memoir, On the Ground, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. The latter course is much more entertaining. For more than 30 years, Brian Stewart was ubiquitous on Canadian televisions as a foreign correspondent and occasional anchor for CBC News. He reported from around the world, from Beirut to El Salvador to London. He interviewed Margaret Thatcher once, more or less by accident. That story is one of the highlights of his new book. And there's a straight line between his reporting about the Ethiopian famine of the early 1980s, in the face of formidable logistical challenges and too much apathy, and the global outpouring of humanitarian support that followed. Few journalists anywhere could show they've done so much good with one of their stories. Now Brian Stewart has a memoir. In some ways, his life foreshadows my own, especially our early days, 20 years apart, at the Montreal Gazette. I hope you'll forgive us trading some hometown stories about Montreal newspaper days. He went further than I ever did, at least if you're counting frequent flyer points. But it's generous of him to write this memoir and invite the rest of us along. Here's my conversation with Brian Stewart. Brian Stewart, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Why on earth did you write a memoir?
I hadn't planned to. I actually had determined I would never write a memoir. And Simon Schuster called me up one day and called me in and I said, would you consider writing a memoir? And of course, I succumbed to flattery always. So they flattered me for 10 minutes. And I said, okay, I'll do it. But actually, the only writing I really wanted to do, and never got around to doing, it's too late now, was espionage novels, spy novels, probably in a historical context. That's the kind of writing I really kind of hanker to do, because I think that journalists are quite good at that.
Well, so one of the surprises in this book was that at one point you actually wrote a treatment for a movie that got a little bit further than nowhere.
A little bit further, but not really out of port, you could say. It's the Monterey Castle. I had a friend in Hollywood who knew, I forget, one of the big actors in action movies, and they wanted to do something serious. So he said, well, I'll ask my friend if he can come up with an idea. And I came up with this idea of a freighter off Vietnam after the fall of Vietnam, when there was a lot of modern day piracy. And I thought then that modern day piracy wasn't covered nearly enough. So I set this freighter, and this really dates the script, with a largely American crew, but international, largely American, off Vietnam, and they get attacked by boat piracies. And it's a whole struggle to survive. So they liked it at first, and it's joined, apparently the number is 780,000 movie scripts that lie in the archives that are never made, and in my case, probably never should be made. So I'm quite happy to know it's never showed.
That's probably all the encouragement I need not to put my hand in. I'm not gifted at fiction, and if the odds are that long, then maybe I shouldn't even try. But
never know. Never know.
The book begins, perhaps inevitably, with your extraordinary work in Ethiopia at a time when Ethiopia really needed the world's eyes on it. Tell me a little bit about why you started there, and remind younger listeners than me what happened in Ethiopia.
Well, in Ethiopia in the mid-'80s, it was under a Marxist regime where there had been civil wars in the north and a number of huge droughts that some international agencies sort of warned about, but were kind of ignored. The kind of thing that didn't even make the back pages. And because the Marxist regime was about to celebrate its 10th anniversary, it didn't want any coverage of food problems in the north. So it barred foreign media from going in there. And as a result, the famine, the droughts got worse, food supplies didn't show up. The warnings were ignored, and a gigantic famine broke out. Famines are fairly rare because they usually have a political and war dimension to them. So this broke out in one of the hardest to reach areas of all Africa, in northern Ethiopia, because of poor logistics and the rest. And I was coming out of Beirut. I'd been covering a lot of Beirut war going on in the 80s. And my producer and I went to the embassy of Ethiopia one day, and he started pushing for visas. Could you let us in? And nobody was being let in. And one day, somewhat to our surprise, after he battered at the doors, Tony Berman, you'll know him, battered at the doors for months, they did, in fact, give CBC the visa, the only visa at that time. Though the BBC were able to catch up to us. We were amazed, but we flew in. And then we flew to the north, and I had read everything I could of aid agency stuff, warning myself. So I kind of tried to mentally prepare myself and get physically fit and mentally fit for what we were about to go into. And then I arrived, and I saw something that struck me as looking like the world after a nuclear holocaust or something. Those roads, as I wrote at the time, famine is along every road and at the gates of every town in northern Ethiopia, and dead were in the streets. People beyond malnutrition were trying to get to feeding camps that could only feed maybe a 10th or even the 15th of the numbers that showed up there. So it was death everywhere. The world wasn't listening. So BBC got a report out that alerted Britain and became famous. And we got ours out that went to Canada on November the 1st, 1984. And first of all, so you have a giant famine, largely ignored by the world. The UN has about to warn that maybe up to 6 or 7 million people might die in this famine. So the term Holocaust, you hear 6 million, may die, and it's hard not to use that term, except I didn't. So we wrote our first report, went out on November 1st, 1984, and Brian Mulroney, just made prime minister, barely weeks in office, was watching it with his family, and they all burst into tears. The next morning, he's so moved, he calls up Stephen Lewis, the former NDP hero, and now Canadian ambassador to the UN. And Lewis takes the call from Mulroney and says, "Hello, Prime Minister." And Mulroney says, "Did you watch the national news last night, the CBC National?" And Lewis said, "Yes, Prime Minister, and I hope that you are about to ask me what I really hope you are going to ask me." And Mulroney just said, "Yes, Stephen, go to New York, alert the world. The UN's not even talking about it at the General Assembly, and Canada is going to lead this fight." And what happened then, that the Mulroney government, in an action never quite seen in peacetime before or since, led the charge in Canada. It said, this is not a government mission alone. We've got to engage the people of Canada. And the government of Canada at that time and the people of Canada going to form this overnight alliance that led to an outpouring of aid and relief in this country and concern over Africa, never seen before and not really seen since. So it was a historic moment. And it just built. Our reports were watched by large numbers in those days. And in Britain, you had Geldof beginning to alert the musicians, and slowly the Ethiopian relief that was to save millions of lives got underway. And all the way through that, and I have to underscore this, people concentrate on media a lot, but the Canadian government played an absolutely heroic role. It was a shining moment, certainly for Mulroney and his government, but it led the charge at the United Nations. In Addis Ababa, the Canadian ambassador was the lead among international agencies. And Joe Clark flies into Addis Ababa. No Western foreign minister had been anywhere near Ethiopia because of its Marxist links to Russia and what have you. And he flew in the middle of an emergency meeting of donors, nations in Addis Ababa. And he was sort of this electric shock of hope that Canada was coming to our rescue. And Canada was urging the Brits and the Americans to also join in as much as possible. Because Mulroney was not only leading, and Joe Clark leading in public in Canada, he was calling Reagan in the White House, and Thatcher and number 10 saying, look, we have to do more than we're doing. This is really serious. We're getting these reports from the field that suggest millions are going to die. And this is not only in Ethiopia, it's now spreading across Africa as well. Maybe 22 million people are going to be at risk in this. So that was the moment it all began, the Great Ethiopian Famine Relief, which was interesting in a historical sense because it all kind of happened in what was being called an age of greed. The 80s were, after Wall's film that came out just before the 80s started. The 80s were thought to be an age when people were just worried, concerned about stock market and profits and getting rich and what have you. And this really impacted in Britain to the effect that Geldof set up the whole Live Aid, the Band-Aid movement, and the record, Don't You Know It's Christmas? And overnight, that led to, in 1984, the summer, the Live Aid experience, which was seen around the world, and it just kept mushrooming that more humanitarian agencies started to form, first by the dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, and tens of thousands. And the amount of giving just went right off the clock. We can talk about that later, but just one example, it still baffles me to this day that Live Aid was one rock show. Britain and the United States went around the world, okay, fine. They appealed for money. There was some footage from CBC that actually caused the greatest outpouring of aid and relief. At the end of a few days, $600 million in today's money had been raised for relief. I mean, that's no charity concert, no giving concert ever has even approached that scale. But it shows the impact, the explosion, really.
And there's a straight line from your reporting to that outpouring in a way that almost no journalist can ever witness and trace. Like during a pause between bands at Wembley Stadium, Bob Geldof shows the crowd and therefore the world your report from Ethiopia. As you've said, it's the morning after your report airs that Brian Mulroney gets the ball rolling. It's no wonder to me, as a guy who's had to put some books together, that's where you begin the story, because it's not only a peak of your career, it's a peak of Canadian journalism.
Yeah, I know. I desperately wanted to tell Canadians that story before it was kind of lost. There's been not enough history given to that period of the 80s. There have been some fine historians that have worked on it. I mean, one called it the report of November the 1st, a political tsunami hit Canada, and that's true. And there's been some work, but not really enough. But I also started with that, not just because it was the seminal moment of my career, and it was the highest point that I've witnessed Canadian statecraft at, but it also had an enormous impact on me personally. I mean, I never felt, people often said, well, what a lucky position you were in to be at that story. Well, in some ways, because I felt I could do it, but in other ways, it impacted on me personally and had a deep, what do I call it, effect, emotional and mental effect on me throughout my career and then later life. You couldn't get out of Ethiopia. And I've talked to other people who were in covering that without being profoundly shaken. I never felt smaller in my life than when I was doing the biggest story of my life. And that's because I was surrounded all the time by people who were dying, were about to enter a dying phase, and I couldn't personally help them. I didn't know first aid. I didn't know what to do with the small ration of food I had. So you're always passing by people who are, lost because you couldn't help more. And I'm also surrounded by these angels, these heroic figures. I mean, in my mind, to this day, I remember nurses. One nurse was called by the British media the second Florence Nightingale. They were just marvelous, heroic individuals that you saw. And then you saw the outpouring of average citizens around the world that were actually doing more than you were doing in some respects. They were giving enormously of their time, of their wealth, what they had. So you felt kind of small. At the same time, you realized you were dealing with something beyond even your imagination in terms of bigness and importance. Oh, by the way, the Live Aid thing was not a report by me. It was the video of CBC. It was video shot by this brilliant cameraman we had, Philippe Biard,
Huh.
of the faces of, I hate to say it, dying or near-death children. And one of them featured a child we had seen almost die, but miraculously survive. And she became the face of famine. They've showed that video clip of CBC done by our editor, Colin Dean, wonderful editor, 4 times through Live Aid. And Geldof says that's when the phones melted. People were crying in the audience. They'd never seen anything quite like it. It was television bringing home, maybe for the first time, the real face of what a famine looks like. And we have to pray we never see another famine, because they're as close to a nuclear holocaust in terms of suffering than you could possibly imagine.
Now, for all of that extraordinary impact that your TV reporting had, you had to be coaxed into TV, but not into journalism. Another thing that stood out to me as I read this account was that you decided quite young you wanted to be a journalist, and you prepared in extracurricular ways, in ways that I would suggest young journalists should, or aspiring journalists should, take as an example of how to get ready for a career in journalism. And it was because of the relatively glamorous cold period that you grew up in, which was the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I had been a kind of post-war child. I was born in the middle of the Second World War, and then I grew up in the post-war era. Korean War also comes along. We played war games all the time. So war and international things were kind of always on my mind from the early days. But I was mainly interested in sports. I had some thought of one day being a sports writer, because I get into games free and be able to wear a little crest past my hat, which was seen in Hollywood in those days. But in the mid 50s, my parents, our family was living in England for 4 years, and I'm going to this British school, boarding school. I know I was a day boy because I lived nearby. And I was watching in 1956, October, November, the Suez Crisis, where Britain went in and invaded Egypt along with France and Israel to try and win back the Suez Canal. And also the Hungarian uprising at that time took place in Budapest. And I was at home at night watching the only 2 channels that carried news in Britain at that time. And I was just amazed at seeing this coverage come out and seeing that there were people there doing their job covering this war. And I thought, I can't believe it. There are people who get paid to go in, and they get paid to go into these places and see history being made, actual history, the history all my life I've been interested in. So I wrote in an essay I wrote at age 14 in this school, when I grow up, I want to be a foreign correspondent. And I was, every time I got detention, which was often, we were sent to the library, and I pulled out the books on World War II and World War I, and I just read a lot of war and military and other history. So I came out of there sort of immersed in this desire to be a witness to history, which I think affects a lot of journalists. I think that's one of the highest aims of journalism, to be, you're the first draft of history, or history on the run. You're there, you see it. But above all, to be at the ringside seat of all this stuff happening. And that's when I came back, I went into journalism in Ryerson, when it was a few journalism schools at that time, and worked over in England. And then in 1967, came back to see basically a centennial year. And I went to Montreal, and by the greatest fortune of my professional life, I ended up being employed by your alma mater, the Gazette, the wonderful, magnificent, weirdo, characterful Montreal Gazette.
Do you know a guy named Joel Ruemy, who was kind of between your time in Montreal and my time?
Unfortunately not. No,
okay.
By the way, I warn you ahead of time, I'm terrible with names. But
yeah. So he ended up being at the Queen's Park Bureau of the Toronto Star in the late 90s. And nobody was ever more badly cast in a Toronto newspaper, because he fueled his existence on nostalgia for Montreal. And he said to me, the thing about working in Montreal is you'll be thrown at stories that could not have happened anywhere else. And so in your first summer at the Gazette, it was Charles de Gaulle's Vive le Québec Libre speech, and then followed close on its heels by Trudeau Mania. And in mine, just for comparison's sake, a random year, 22 years later, I got the Oka crisis, the collapse of the Meech Lake Accord, and the École Polytechnique massacre. That's your apprenticeship. Do what you can with it, and you were off and running in your case. Uh, like and the machine that drives it is the astonishing city of Montreal.
Oh my gosh. And it's so moving. I always think of it almost as the city of unrequited love, because it could never love me as much as I loved it. In some ways, it didn't love me at all. So I was very early on made city hall reporter covering Mayor Drapeau during the October crisis. I was at ground zero when the troops were being brought in. But the other thing about Montreal, first of all, life was wonderful in those days, back in the 60s. It was we all know, a bit of a wide open, fun time. Our scene was still respectable, and a lot of character to it. But one of the things that always struck me right off the bat, you were kind of a Canadian domestic reporter, but it was like reporting for a foreign correspondent at the same time. It's very international flair. And the number of foreigners coming through, which we got to interview because Montreal was a big Arab hub in those days, just gave it this sparkle of being a world city, a world-class city. And I said, for a young journalist, there were certain cities you died to be in. New York in the 1920s, Rome maybe in the 1950s, London in the 60s, which I'd been actually in London for the wonderful wild 60s of the mid-period. And then I thought, Montreal had to be the best city in the world to be a journalist in the 1960s. And we loved it so much. And I was happy as a clam as a journalist there when TV came calling, which I never thought of ever doing.
Can I bug you to remind me where the Montreal Gazette office was in those days?
Well, we were down by the post office then.
Okay.
Close to the park and I forget the name of the big hotel, but it was right next to the post office, St. Antoine Street. It was called the old lady of St. Antoine Street or something.
Yeah.
And it was very much for the Anglo community and the kind of was a Tory paper, but it had these radical so many radical reporters in those days reporting from the newsroom. They call one corner of the newsroom Red Square. That's where I met a lot of people like Nick Oftermeyer, who became a famed politician and boulevardier in Montreal at that period, but also introduced me to a lot of to sort of activists of that period. And you even had people like Mark Starwitz, who was head of the McGill Daily in those days. So,
well, this is it. I mean,
journalist skills coming into the city.
It's a handy reminder. Be nice to everyone, because you never know in what incarnation you're going to be dealing with them later. Because Starowitz, who was running the McGill Daily, which is kind of a lark, ends up instead of sort of creating the modern CBC with the Journal in 1982, which was where you hung your hat for many years.
Yeah, and going back to the Gazette for 1 minute, it's interesting because my career, I only went to TV later. I explained it because I thought they had more foreign bureaus than print, so maybe I got a foreign correspondent earlier. But I love print so much, and what I really valued most of all was your role, being a columnist. And I thought being a columnist for print in Canada was about heaven reached. I mean, first of all, I think this country has great columnists. I'm not saying this to be flattering, but I just love the columnists in this country. And I'd put them up against any in the English-speaking world that I certainly follow. And I think there's nothing finer than having your own back 40 column to write in. So I was settled in quite happily into that when I was asked if I'd like to move into TV and the local CBC supper hour show. And my first instinct was to say no, but I just got suckered into it. And then I thought, wait a minute, CBC has foreign bureaus. This would be my best chance to get there finally.
Yeah. And there must be a kind of a period of mourning if you're a good writer going into TV, because TV has just fabulous opportunity. And the biggest among them is the ability to show people what you see, but you've got to write, like you must have had to learn to edit yourself just ruthlessly in order to get that access to the visual element.
Yes, I put a very pompous spin on it. I said, TV is poetry and print is prose. So I thought of a well-written TV script was more poetic, whereas the print stuff was brilliant, could be brilliant prose. And so that allowed me to get over the first shock of losing a lot of words I wanted to add and sentences I would have put in. It's like giving up, oh my gosh, I'm taking that out. But later I got fond of the edit process itself. I think editing is very creative, and I rather enjoyed the process of editing. Yeah, a lot of print people, as you know, went into television in that period. Almost all of us were absolutely horrible at first, and I was probably the most horrible of all because I was a nervous wreck on camera to start with, and that took some getting over. But I often look back and said, was that the dumbest move I ever made? To leave the Gazette, the possibility of one day a column in Canada, across Canada column, to go to television. And I often had that in my mind for some years afterwards.
Yeah. But I mean, I'll be honest with you. If you've got a column, as I did at Maclean's for many years, boy, the temptation to coast is ever present, right? Just mail in another 800 words of flatulence and no one will be the wiser, which is why I've always kind of goaded myself to get out of the newsroom and go and look at stuff. And of course, if you're in television, that's all you're allowed to do. And so the discipline is sort of built in.
Yeah.
Tell me about how you got your interview with Margaret Thatcher. It's one of my favorite stories in this book.
Well, I've been covering Thatcher for 2 years already in the London Bureau. I was London correspondent. And of course, I've seen the Iron Lady come into her full ironness during the Falklands War. And we had been filled with stories of people, just shaking with terror in front of her. She loved the title Iron Lady, and it was part of her personality. Anyways, one day we were sitting in the office with Tony Berman was the producer again, and somebody came running in and said, "Okay, it's all on." Then they told Berman. He said to me, "Okay, we've just been called by number 10 Downing Street to say our interview is on with the Prime Minister. We have to be there at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." And I'm saying, "What interview? I didn't ask for an interview. He didn't ask for an interview." We're running around the office screaming, "Did anyone ask for an interview with Thatcher?" And not us. We didn't ask. So Tony says to me, "I think they made a mistake. It must have been maybe some other network." But, I can hardly call number 10 back and say, we're not coming in because you called the wrong network. We didn't ask for an interview, so we won't be there. So we agreed to go in, and he and I arrive at number 10 and go through the security and all that. And then the big chief press aide at the time for Thatcher, who was a terrifying looking guy, she even called him once the Dracula of the Northlands or something. And he said, "Okay, what time is your morning show? What are you going to roll?" And I said, we looked at him and said, "We don't have a morning show on CBC." And he said, "CBC?" I said, "Yes, CBC." And I saw a look of absolute terror come over this terrifying face. And he goes off and he comes back and said, I said, "Don't worry, I'll do the interview, but somewhere middle of it, I'll kind of pause as if for a commercial break, because this would be career disaster for him. God only knows what it would mean for CBC in England if we were this mess." So we line up behind 3 American networks, and my time eventually comes. She comes out. We sit in the garden of number 10 Downing Street under a tree that keeps dropping buds into her throat, which causes coughing fits, which does not put her in a good mood at all. And so it turns out my time comes, and I sit down, and she's rather pleasantly says, "How are you?" And with about as much interest as a cockroach had crawled across in front of her. By the way, I'm impressed by her. I didn't like Thatcher, but I was very, very impressed by her skills and power. And we began the interview. It was turned out to be a rather boring interview, I have to admit. But about 3 or 4 minutes in, I paused, look at Tony, as if for a quick break, and then come back. And I kept thinking at some stage, if it runs through her mind that we're not the people she thinks should be there, what's then going to happen to us in the garden of number 10 Downing Street? So we get the interview, rush back to the office, and it goes out. And then we had a tremendous job trying to get some Canadian show interested enough in an interview. We had an exclusive with Thatcher because, as you know, if there's an interview and there's no news around it, it's not pointed. What is it? Nobody wants to take it. And Berman always said, we could hardly phone up CTV and tell them, sorry, you might as well drop your request for an interview with Thatcher because they gave it to us instead. So we didn't. I've never been able to prove it was a mistake, but we're both very sure it was. There's no question.
The and CTV never busted you. Like whoever was at the CTV bureau at that time might even be learning about this mix-up by reading it in your book.
Yes, what I hope for to even things out is they can remember back a wonderful interview they got in London in the 1984-85 period that was really meant for us, but they got. And in those kind of sometimes sloppy days, odd things like that could happen. So I'm sure somewhere there's a brilliant interview with somebody that was really meant for CBC, but they got.
It's interesting because, of course, very much in those days, and perhaps ever more ever since, the audience is caught up in nonstop speculating about the motives and the methods of journalists, and telling themselves that it's all a big plot to deliver a certain mindset to the Canadian people or to indoctrinate the Canadian people into this or that. But on the ground, you're thinking, my God, I'll just take what I can get. Like it's far more chaotic than people imagine.
Oh, way more. It can be more exhausting and tiresome. And I must say, my heart bleeds at times for today's reporters who face many, many more challenges in some ways than we did. We all have our different eras to work in, and we had our own challenges. But when I think of them today, like CBC, you file for the National, then you maybe file for radio, and then you digitally sit down and write a story as well. I mean, where are you getting enough research time, enough time to go out and talk to people in the streets and the cafes, enough time to go around to embassies and get briefings? We had that kind of time, but you're right. The thing that's on your mind is not to advance a political cause, it's to get a story right so it doesn't blow up in your face. Have the facts right and be able to file it on time and hopefully of a quality that people like. I always use the term the CIF. I don't know whether it's still used, but we always refer to this could be a CIF, which was career in flames move. And we all have them, when we do a story and something's a little off, you wonder, is this my career in flames moment? And I've had one or two of those. So you're not sitting there thinking, gee, ideologically, I think it'd be great if we could pronounce this. Though I do sometimes worry that more ideology has bled into some reporting today than I wish was the case. At some level, but that's sort of strong management has to make sure that doesn't happen too often.
I've heard your friend and colleague Peter Mansbridge, now that he's doing the independent podcast thing, a little bit like me, lament a little bit the stories that the CBC won't tell, or the stories that the CBC insists on telling 100 times, or the to some extent that he doesn't see himself in today's CBC. Do you ever feel the same way?
Yeah, well, I'm going to preface that by saying I'm getting very encouraged that the CBC is going to have a big updraft, because I think its work in the last year has been absolutely excellent, as is CTV's. I think they really, really have done wonderful work under enormous pressure with the Canadian crisis, with the world crisis, with what's going on in the world. And their reporting has been top notch, and their panels are absolutely excellent, better than any American panels I can think of. So that's on the good side. I think there was a time when a generation perhaps of journalists came in with the misunderstanding that the career was a chance to be an activist. And it was their opportunity to push their own agenda. And too much leeway was given in certain cases, and not just at CBC, but certainly for a while at CBC. You could turn on the news and say, oh, we're going to get this number of minoritarian stories or complaint stories, or it became like almost a continual moan. And what wasn't being done on television, and still isn't being done enough on television, are what we used to call process stories. I mean, people have lost faith in governments, or they've lost a lot of faith in governments. Um, partially, partially due to obviously to their own misrule, but also to the fact that really since the 1970s and Watergate and the rest of it, the media went on a kind of conflict story, what Senator Daniel Moynihan once called a bias towards negativity. And I think there was too much of that reporting altogether. And I'm absolutely complicit. I was the CBC's first national investigative reporter, and I did a lot of investigative reporting. But I thought that should be in its place. I didn't want to see conflict stories that take over. And unfortunately, there began to be a bit of a bias in television news, certainly, and probably in print as well, against what they call process stories. I mean, stories that show how government works actually well, how a government can get an alliance with the opposition, how it can take care of sewers and cities and ports and the rest of it, how it can operate, what it does on overseas aid, for instance, not just that some be spent, but the real detail of government, which isn't covered nearly enough to show citizens just how, first of all, difficult it is to get right, how much effort goes into making it right, and frankly, more often than people think, they do get right. I mean, we can all come up with a million stories of what goes wrong, but there are also hundreds of thousands of stories that where actually government's working pretty damn well, and under great pressure, under great difficulty. So I wish media would start expanding coverage more to show what actually works. And I'm not talking about this great party or that great party, but how the parties work together, and how the much maligned rather civil servants often do extraordinarily good work, not always overstaffed work. And for instance, foreign aid is a classic example. Very little coverage is given of foreign aid, and usually it's a debate over how much money we're going to spend. Very little do you see reports coming in from the field of, look at this program that Canada's been running in northern Ethiopia. Look at this program that Canada has helped get off the ground in South America and stuff like that, and how it's actually doing some good, because those are seen as process stories. And I wish we could actually get back to a time where there was a little less of the daily conflict and complaint, a little bit more of the creativity of human government.
How it works is part of the baggage of information and context that help the audience understand what's going on. And the other one I hear sometimes from editors is, well, we got to get past institutional coverage. We can't have so much institutional coverage. And I think, my God, the Supreme Court, the executive branch, executive federalism, intergovernmentalism, you can dump on that and say it's institutions, but it's also how things work or why they don't. And it kind of handy to check in on that stuff from time to time.
Absolutely. The Defense Department's another big example where the coverage is too slim. We have some excellent defense correspondents in Canada, but not nearly enough of them. And people should be given a better, more honest appraisal of what is working well, but also what isn't working well. Where simple maintenance of equipment, for instance, has fallen by the wayside. I saw your wonderful interview with the General Ayres the other night. He pointed out that often it's just things falling apart, or the lack of maintenance, the rest of it that has to be seen to. People, all of us, need to understand how important that is to maintain things properly and do the non-glamorous work, but also it all builds towards, the high professionalism and, even though I hate to use the term, but elitism of certain units.
Now, your career spanned a very complex period in history, and you went from shooting film to shooting video to delivering the stuff via satellite to the internet and smartphones. Is it possible to generalize and say that technology improves journalism, or are you not so sanguine about the changes that you saw?
I'm not sanguine, actually. It's easy to point to areas where it has. I mean, the information at the fingertips of journalists today is mind-boggling. I mean, even covering the war in Ukraine remotely, there's so much open source intelligence, for instance, one can tap into You can follow the battlefield in minute detail, which we never could in our time, unless you went there and put your hide at risk. However, I worry mainly about journalism being utterly overwhelmed. The title I almost used for my book, but a wise editor thankfully saved me from doing so, was Beyond the Vortex. Because I had in mind this, I've been for decades now feeling that journalism, certainly international coverage journalism, is caught up in this vortex of 24/7 crises and conflicts and catastrophes and the rest of it. And the pressure on journalism these days to feed the bird, feed the satellite, feed the mission, come up with something, anything is just overwhelming the ability of smaller staffs, smaller editorial desks and the rest of it to deal with. And the technology becomes, after a while, a monster. It's what those broomsticks were running around, be multiplying, Sorcerer's Apprentice. It becomes a real danger. And I think I should also say it's not just journalism. I think governments now are absolutely caught in a vortex of action and demands and conflicts and the rest of it. That's very difficult to deal with. And I think governments are under far more stress than they let on. They're more tired. I mean, people in public office are often very tired individuals, sleep deprived. I once had a conversation with a former American Secretary of State who said, who also graduated the same year, 64 I did. She said, when we graduated, the world had 5 billion people fewer than today. We had 64 countries. Now we have 194 countries. And no small country can be taken for granted and ignored anymore. There is absolutely no time. Every second of a day now is spent dealing with one problem after another problem. And if you're not dealing with the problems, you're trying to explain it to the media or attend a press conference or a congressional hearing and the rest of it. We underestimate the degree of mind-boggling demands and pressure we put on our statespeople, our statespersons, and our politicians. And it's on journalists, it's on those in government. And I think that's this kind of crisis without a name that's awaiting us down the road. And we're all going to have to face it. How do we deal with so much pouring in and so much of questionable value? I won't even get into the conspiracy theories and the people desiring to stay in their silos of information. Hear only news from one very narrow focus and only on one subject. That kind of stuff are all giant crises for journalism now. And it's a historic responsibility for you journalists still in the game to deal with this, what can you call it, tsunami or vortex of info pouring over you.
I mean, I've got to agree with your editor. Beyond the Vortex is not a great title, but noticing the vortex is handy. I mean, your book is one of a few things I've seen and read over the last year that remind me that it wasn't necessarily better in the old days, but there was a time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, where it seemed the barriers to entry weren't quite as pervasive, and that once you were in a big organization, TV network, a large news organization, you could get in that truck and you could drive it wherever your wits would take you. And you didn't have to fill out so many damn forms. And now, this is actually, you were kind enough to mention my interview with General Eyre. He talked about a constant combat against the amount of paperwork there is in any large organization, and paralyzingly so in the military. I guess all I can say is that your book reminds us of simpler times and reminds us of the importance of getting back to that.
I was very lucky in my generation. Was that, when we graduated, we had farm teams. I mean, my first job was with the Oshawa Times, and I covered everything from flower shows to emergencies at the hospitals to road accidents, you name it. And you had these 1 or 2 years you had to do just about everything in the game. Yeah. And then you got a little bit higher. And as you say, you went in the door, and you got your job, then you could drive your van in so many different directions. And nowadays, I was talking to a senior news personality manager the other day. So nowadays, graduates, they don't have a farm team to work out in. So the few that get in get thrown in immediately at a higher level. It's like you don't have a AA and AAA leagues to fine tune your skills. You're suddenly in the majors. And we all know that's going to be a disastrous kind of career move if you're not careful. So the long-term training and provision is a problem there. They don't have the number of editors, senior people that can give advice or be mentors. There's very little time for mentoring, whereas a very important thing for me in my career were the older reporters who could mentor and the desk people who could mentor. That's not there nearly enough today. And I think they have to work on something in broadcasting to get a farm team back and running more. I'm glad to see CBC's opening more local reporting jobs. Something like 30 of them are being scheduled to be reopened. That's a good first step. And also to hire more reporters from the local scene is a good idea. But the other thing too is I think we had a background and certainly in the foreign coverage area, we had a better background in history classes, history education, global education, citizenship, and all that kind of stuff. And we grew up surrounded by veterans of this war, this emergency, and that great moment. So we had maybe more of a context of the world. Entering it, it was a smaller world, but we had a great context than perhaps today exists. And that has to be worked on too, and I'm sure it will be, because I see possibly good times ahead.
Now, compared to you, I've only dabbled in foreign correspondent work and in global affairs, but one of the things that I sort of had to work at realizing and admitting to myself is that the people involved in the headiest international crises and conflicts and challenges aren't necessarily more serious people than the people at city council. that you're in the sort of councils of the world, but often you haven't got a clue what you're talking about or how to fix what you're trying to fix.
That's so true. I remember when I was on the eve of the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, and I was down covering the UN for a bit. And I remember sitting there in the General Assembly watching through and seeing all the people there, and the diplomats and the politicians, say, it isn't very much different from the Oshawa City Council in 1965. I mean, they're kind of all doing it. The games are being played, the levers are being pulled that have to be pulled, the deals are being made. And you're absolutely right. It's if you can, the human drama that is involved in government is involved very much at the local level, as much as it is at the very highest level. And that's a great place for a reporter to learn a lot of the skills, get into local government and see how it functions, see how it fails, see how it succeeds, see what's needed to really have good governance and what's unfortunately there to provide poor governance. I mean, I had a master teacher in a draft of Montreal. I've rarely in my life come across a political figure with more skill. I only put him on a Thatcher level of being iron about it. But he was a sort of master urban politician who taught me a lot. Again, this is not meant to flatter, but I also think too, there's not enough irony in Canadian journalism and wit, and you provide that. I wish there was a little bit less of a sanctimonious and a little bit more of a ironic and relaxed and human touch that involves humor at times in our journalism. And that could deal with a bit of pumping up.
Do you miss it?
Not in the way I'd like to be there doing it again. Even if I was 10, 20 years younger, I wouldn't want to be out there in today's front lines that much. I really think it's incredibly dangerous and frustrating. I miss, everyone will say the camaraderie, I miss that, but I miss waking up every morning and saying, gosh, I wonder what new thing I'm going to see today. Or I miss the challenge of rushing for a deadline, even though they drove me mad at the time. I really sometimes miss the finishing a column. I wrote a column for CBC Digital as well, or a documentary script and saying, it's a good one. I think I did it well this time, or I better do it again for my fifth time or something. sometimes, as you know, you hit it out of the park, and I hate to use a light analogy like that, but the first report from Ethiopia was one I don't think I'd slept more than 2 hours and 2 nights. When I sat down the typewriter and I just started my little portable typewriter, just started typing. And the only time I can remember my career where I never rewrote anything, I just wrote it through once and broadcast it. And I look back at it now and I wouldn't change a word. That happens very, very rarely. But there are times when your profession calls for it, the moment. And being able to reach that moment is something I think you always miss thereafter, that kind of thing. But there are many joys to being retired, I must say. And the first years after leaving broadcasting and being retired were magical ones of rest and recreation for me.
Man, don't tempt me. I'm not there yet. But
Yeah.
anyway, thanks. This has been so much fun, and the fun began when I was reading the book, which is called On the Ground: My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. Brian Stewart, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
And that's the show. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my executive producer, Suzanne Hancock. Have a great day.